Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well. We are here to talk about all things well-being, and today this topic is super close to my heart because if you've been following the show, you know that I have a lot of cats that I love. And today we're talking about strengthening the human-animal bond for your mental health and animal welfare. And my guest today is perfect to talk about this topic. She's super passionate about the human-animal bond as well as animal welfare. And I'm excited for her to share a little bit about her story with you all very soon. But before we start, Courtney Wennerstrom, my guest today, is a writer, content creator, and animal welfare professional with a diverse professional background. And in case you're wondering what the background is about, I'm going to throw over to Courtney right now so she can introduce herself. Thank you so much for being here in our virtual studio, Courtney. Please introduce a bit about your story and how you got here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to be talking to someone from the future, as we discussed, since I'm in Denver, Colorado, and very far away from you. But yeah, I have a kind of fun professional background. I'm a former visiting lecturer at Indiana University in English with a specialty in 18th century and Romantic era literature. So that means I studied literature between the period of about 1740 and 1820-ish. So up to Jane Austen, about a little bit after. And I loved teaching and I loved writing. I loved my academic work, but I am also very, very passionate about animal welfare and the human-animal bond, and eventually decided that I wanted to pursue that instead. So for the past 5 years, I've been working in different projects in animal welfare. I worked for a nonprofit called Michelson Found Animals, which has a completely free national microchip registry. And in that role, I was able to work with hundreds of shelters and rescues across the central United States, trying to help them figure out how to get more pets home when they get lost. And that is actually a life-saving technique because the quicker you can get pets back to their families, the more room you have and resources you have to help animals who are truly seeking their forever families get the help they need. And that was a really cool role where I learned a ton. I also worked for the Humane Society of the United States has a program called Pets for Life. And it's a really amazing program that works in under-resourced communities to offer free or low-cost, usually free spay-neuter programs, as well as veterinary care. And so I also got to work with a lot of really amazing pets and people in that role. And now I am working as a freelance writer and content producer. I am the host of a podcast as well called the capital PETestal on the human-animal bond. And I'm working on a podcast with a colleague coming up about pet loss. So yes, pets sounds like we have a lot in common with our mutual love of animals.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I actually lost one of my cats last year. And when you said that you're working on a podcast about pet loss, that just made me pause for a second. I think the love for animal is kind of different for each person, but it's a topic that's super close to my heart. I think if anything, I hope that this episode will inspire more people to think about this bond that we have with animals. And it can range from anything, even if they're not a pet owner, they can start to look at animals around them differently. I think that's also the most important thing, and that's what I realized when I started having cats. I look at animals very differently, and we'll talk about animal welfare. And I know that you're passionate about talking about different things related to what we discussed earlier, the dark side of the U.S. shelter system. So, we'll definitely leave some room for that towards the end. But yeah, let's talk about you first. Let's get to know you a bit better before we go into the topic of the day. So we have the first section, which is called "Have You Met Courtney?" We've heard about your professional background. It's a super interesting background, and I think you'll have a lot of great recommendations in this part because we'll get to know you a bit more personally. The first question I love asking, and this is probably the perfect question for you because you used to teach literature. What is your favorite book?
Isn't that always one of the hardest questions?
Yeah,
because there's so many.
One.
There's so many really good books. Honestly, I don't know that anybody would read it, but one of my favorite books is called Clarissa. And the reason I say that is it is about 2,000 pages long. It was written by Samuel Richardson, who's considered in some ways to be the father of the novel that we know of, or as we think of it. But it is a super wild 18th century tale. It's very tragic, but it's very interesting because it's all written in letters. So it's an epistolary novel. And it is about an aristocratic woman whose very, very evil father is trying to marry her off to someone who is absolutely horrifying. Like he's just an absolutely horrible, like unethical person, and she doesn't want to do it. And so she ends up running away from her family into the arms of a man who's a rake and a libertine, and he rapes her and then she dies. And so it's a really tragic story, but what's compelling about it is how fascinating it is because it's all human psychology. Really, it's just an interesting look into the human psyche because it's all, again, through first person letters. So it's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's not a quick nor a very happy read, but it is a page turner and it's incredibly gripping.
Yeah, obviously it sounds a bit dark, but actually very interesting. I would put that on my list for sure because, it's great to read happy, fun stuff, but it's also really good to read things that get you think about the human psyche, just like you said. So,
and one thing about that is if you do read it, you will join a very small group of crazy people who have actually gone through the process.
I like the idea of that. I like the sound of that. I'll sign up for it. Yeah. I love reading, so I'll sign up for that. Okay, next one. What is a movie you would recommend?
Oh gosh, I love so many movies. Where do you start with that? I'm trying to think. I used to teach an entire section on film in my classes, in my composition classes, and that was always really fun. There's so many different kinds of genres of film that are fascinating to me. I was trying to think of an animal-related one, but those always make everyone cry. For obvious reasons. I think another one of my favorite movies, which is also very tragic, but the one that's coming to mind is called City of God. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but it's about Brazilian street gangs in the 90s. It's a super compelling movie.
Oh, wow.
That I really liked. All from the perspective of a reporter who captures everything on camera. So that's a really good movie.
Yeah, that sounds so interesting. I'll have to watch that.
Yes, please let me know what you think after I've depressed you for 2 straight nights in a row.
Well, I'm kind of in a mellow mood anyway, so that's actually really good. I like that. Awesome. Okay, so you said you host a podcast and you are also working on another one that's coming out. You're the guest of our podcast now. I'm pretty sure you're a podcast person. So what is a podcast you would recommend?
Oh gosh, there's a couple of ones that I love podcasts, and I'd first give a shout out to my sister because I call myself the podcast princess. She is absolutely the podcast queen because she listens to every podcast first and then she recommends them to me. And it's funny because every time I think, I found one that maybe Ashley hasn't listened to. Nope, she actually already has. One was really fun called, it was about Victoria's Secret, the whole history of Victoria's Secret, called Fallen Angel. That was really interesting.
Wow.
Not only about the company, but like the founder's ties to Jeffrey Epstein, all kinds of interesting things, and just about the history of how the company came to be. And that one was really good. There's another one called The Ballad of Billy Balls, which is a wild, wild ride that starts off as a kind of murder mystery, but ends up as a much more fascinating cultural critique. That one's really good too.
Oh, wow. So many interesting things I've learned today.
Right? There's so many fun things to listen to. Podcast, there's listen. Also, Queen of the Con. That's another really good one about women con artists and how they do what they do. That's another good one.
I love the sound of that. I would listen to that for sure. Oh, cool. I'm getting all the great recommendations today. All right. Next question is a bit more on the personal side to you. Who would be your famous role model? Or if not a famous person, then who's your personal role model?
Oh, that's a good one. You know who I really love is Brene Brown, because who does not love Brene Brown, right?
I love Brene.
Right? And talk about a movie recommendation that I don't know if you knew that she's in a movie called Wine Country.
Really?
Yes, it's a comedy, and she shows up in it, and it's hysterical. But yeah, I mean,
I have no idea.
I love her because I think her work is so helpful in getting people to have a sense of well-being, right? Like it's she's very connected to the whole theme of this podcast, because getting rid of shame and really kind of thinking through the authentic self and how we thrive when we're not kind of bogged down by these unbelievably horrible emotions that do no good for anyone. I love her work. I really, really do. Yeah.
I love her work. And may I just say, you sound a little bit like her.
Well, thank you. That's the best compliment ever. She's so amazing.
Yeah, because when we started talking, I was kind of like, you give me Brene Brown vibes.
Brene Brown, if you are listening, this is one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten. You know, she has this on her Unlocking Us podcast.
Yes.
Talks about fangirling out over one of her guests, or many of them, but I'm like, yes, I fangirl out over Brene Brown.
Yeah, I know, right? Love her so much. Yeah, her podcast just gives me a boost every single time. Like, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, or I don't listen to podcasts religiously, but whenever I do, I'm like, let's see what Brene has, you know? Love that.
Yeah, her perspective is great.
Yeah, love it. And next one, I'm quite sure you are the perfect person to talk about the learning, because you teach. Seems like you do a lot of research yourself and you absorb a lot of information. What is a course you completed that you really love?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously I loved teaching. I loved teaching so much. And I loved all of my different classes in grad school for different reasons. I think one of my most formative was with Professor Jill Haidt-Stevenson, who is a real life mentor and best friend of mine who teaches at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it was her class on Jane Austen. Because what I learned about looking at literature from that perspective is you can look at a single author at a single period of time, and you can do a deep delve into the psyche, and you can get an incredibly broad history both before and after the novel, and really understand how literature is never made in a vacuum and how it is created and co-created by a culture. So she really kind of helped open my eyes to the fascinating world of 18th century and Romantic era Britain, which is wild. You know, you've got the French Revolution going on. You have so many changes in the way they're defining intimacy, the way they're looking at things like concepts of marriage, the idea of marriage. The way we think of it was a new burgeoning idea from about 1750. The idea that you should actually maybe like your partner instead of just being married to them for titles and inheritance and all of that sort of thing. You have so you all have all the political upheaval. You have all of the Enlightenment and cultural ideas that are coming to the forefront. It's just a really fascinating time.
Yeah, it does sound like a very fascinating time. I love that. Wow. Now you've given me this like urge to learn more about literature. You know, like I read a lot, but it doesn't mean that I know too much about literature in general. It was kind of like something I was forced to learn in the past, and that really just not helping anyone. You know, if you really want to like something, the last thing you want to be doing is be forced to learn it.
Right.
So yeah, now I have this new zest for learning. You know, this is great. All right. So we've covered a little bit about different things that you enjoy, that you recommend. I'm pretty sure our audience have got to know you a bit better. So let's talk about well-being and the human-animal bond and animal welfare, our favorite topic. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. And first thing first, this is the show about well-being. So I would love to ask you, Courtney, what does well-being mean to you?
And I love that question. And I love that you're getting so many different perspectives on it. I feel like for me, well-being is being able to develop resilience so that you can face adversity with grace and determination and come out with a growth mindset, understanding that we can transmute our pain into beauty, that it is there to teach us something, and that rather than define or destroy us, it can actually, help us to kind of get the life we want and create the life that we need. I think well-being is a complicated thing because it's certainly not the same for everyone. I mean, not everyone would need the same things. But I do think that basically I do believe that we need to have our needs met, and those are spiritual, emotional, psychological, physical. They're just certain things that I think connect us all. And when we're not getting our needs met and when we're not living an authentic life, then we're bound to not be well, right? And that can manifest in all kinds of different ways. We live in a really complicated world that's just full of stress and anxiety and challenges. So I think well-being is about trying to figure out what you can do to feed your own resilience so that you're able to better cope with that. And then in turn, you're a better friend, a better human, you have better relationships with everyone in your life, and including to yourself, which obviously is huge.
Yeah. That's such an interesting way of looking at well-being because, as you said, we gather a lot of different perspectives about well-being on this show. I think this is the first time I've heard resilience being thrown into the mix. And there's so many ways to look at well-being. And one of the things that a lot of other guests also agree with you is, the fact that it's different for different people, and we need to figure it out for ourselves. And it's very important to prioritize not only ourselves, but also people, how we're going to interact with people around us. And the fact that you threw in resilience has got me to think about it a little bit differently today, because you know what? I have been looking at well-being through the lenses of the guest. And I also noticed that for myself, it's kind of interesting when you think about the different things going on in your life. Things could be going really great one day and then the next day is not. And it doesn't mean that you don't have a sense of well-being, but you do actually need to train your resilience so that you don't stray too far away from your balance. Like, that's how I look at it. And when you mention resilience, I'm like, yeah, actually, you know what? That's true. And fun fact, Life Management Science Labs has a show about resilience too. So if anyone's interested, we have the personal resilience insights podcast called Bouncing Back. So there we go.
Ooh, I look forward to listening to that one.
Yeah, it's actually really good. I think it's hard because you talk about all the different difficult things that you have to face in life, how you're going to deal with different challenges. But I think it's better. It's good to be prepared, especially because when it comes to well-being, we're all about, at the end of the day, the work that we're doing here, I think it's so much about, fostering well-being for everyone. Because we want everyone to have a good life, and a good life comes with well-being. So I think it's actually really good to be prepared rather than finding coping strategies when you're in the face of difficulties. And that's what I've learned for myself. I used to have unhealthy coping mechanisms when something happened and affected my well-being. But now through, the process of learning all the different insights, even if it hasn't happened to me, it never happened to me before, I can kind of, find the healthy coping mechanisms to improve my well-being, which is great.
I love that you bring that up because we all have unhealthy coping mechanisms. And then I think after a while, we realize they just don't work.
Yep.
Right?
100%.
And we also realize that we just can't run away from adversity either. Right. And in fact,
absolutely,
it's a great teacher. And so you're absolutely right that once we can cultivate resilience, there's really nothing you can't face.
Yeah, that is so true. And you know what? That is related to the next question that I want to ask you. We touched on some of the things that people used to think about in a different way, i.e. misconception. So what would be some of the misconceptions that you notice people have when it comes to well-being?
Yeah, I think it's very related. You're right that it was a natural segue. I think that people are striving for a kind of almost utopic and impossible sense of happiness. And I don't think happiness is really what we should be striving for, because I think it's intangible. I think life is it's too dynamic. It's always changing. And I don't think that staying in a kind of total sense of happiness, whatever that would even mean, is realistic. Because again, what does that even mean? What does happiness even mean? I read this great book, or at least I'm halfway through, called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
I love that book.
Have you read it?
I have. I love that book.
Yeah,
there's another one after that one as well.
Oh, I have to read it. But I think he's absolutely right that wishing to be in a static state of anything is it's unrealistic, and it's not going to bring you deep joy, and it's not going to bring you anything lasting. And so instead of trying to say like, what would make me happy? I love how he flips it around and says, no, in fact, what am I willing to suffer for?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like what am I willing to strive for that makes it different? So I'll give you a pretty personal example. So I have fibromyalgia, and which is a kind of pain disorder, right? And an invisible illness that I've struggled with for about a decade. And I went on a train trip about 2 years ago from LA to Portland. That was supposed to be a fun trip, but it ended up being a very long trip and not having a lot of good food on the train because it was still COVID. And long story short, that 33 hours was kind of an awakening for me. Like, I didn't feel well at all when I got to Portland. And I remember thinking, if this is what aging is going to be like with fibromyalgia, like, I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I called my husband and I was crying and I was like, I don't want this anymore. I can't do this anymore. And I just knew that I was going to have to take a drastic change. So I started doing strength training 3 days a week. I do CrossFit. I had done yoga and walking before, but like, I thought, I'm going to have to do something kind of dramatic here. And so I started that, and I realized that I had low testosterone because a lot of women after 40, we don't make it anymore. And it's just a very important human hormone that regulates a lot of things. And they now think that fibromyalgia might be related to testosterone deficiency. But anyway, so I started strength training. I started doing that, just a bunch of other things, and really fighting for my health. And I remember thinking, I have to fight for my life. And what I do in the gym is really hard. It hurts. It's uncomfortable, and it's incredible. It's actually saved my life, and it's given me my life back. So when I'm in there and my trainer's making me do something absolutely harrowing, and I think I aren't going to get through this, I have to say to myself, I suffer now so that I can live later, right? Like, this is temporary sufferings, because the truth is we're all going to suffer. And there's the kind of suffering that's for nothing, right? It's for just to maintain the status quo. Like, I was suffering with fibromyalgia. Then there's the kind of suffering that you do because it actually gets you somewhere. It actually matters, right? It's the suffering that gets you out of the suffering.
Yeah, so true. That's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, I love that so much because I totally relate with you on so many fronts. And a fun fact, here's the fun fact. I'm also hosting the Humane Science Insights Podcast for LMSL. And in that, we learn so much about happiness. And to be honest with you, I have been learning about it so much, but I still don't understand what it is. And all I know is I don't have to chase it. It's already from within. And if I don't feel happy today, it doesn't mean that happiness is not there. And when you mentioned happiness, I was like, yeah, that is such a big misconception, because happiness and well-being, they have this kind of like overlapping area where, it's hard to define one without the other. And you just said it beautifully. And then on the topic of, suffering, I relate to that so much, because earlier this year, I was actually feeling like depression is looming over me for many different reasons. And I've been there before, and I know that I would not get out of bed if I keep going the same way that I was. And so I signed up for the gym, started doing Pilates every morning. And you know what? I want to get out of bed because I want to go to that class and suffer whatever the trainer says I'm going to do. Even this morning, I was doing the same thing. Right. I was like literally sweating so much and dying, but I was like, I'm so glad I got out of bed today.
I love that.
early in the morning, I'm so glad I got out of bed. I'm so glad that I am feeling all this pain because I feel alive and I'm actually moving on with my life and going ahead with my days and not letting depression beat me and just, leave me in bed like it used to. So that's what I appreciate about, the suffering part that you just talked about. I love that so much. It's beautiful.
And congratulations for doing that for yourself. It's a really big deal. I feel like, I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the United States, there's kind of there's kind of a distrust of movement. Like exercise can't possibly do that much for you. And it really can. And it doesn't have to be, there's not one kind of exercise, right? Like we were saying before, well-being is very personal. And there's like a million ways to move your body. And that could be singing and dancing around your house.
Yeah.
That can be just feeling the joy, like, as you said, of being alive and being in your body and being connected to something bigger than yourself. I think it really helps.
Absolutely. Totally. When we were in the pandemic, a lot of people became pet parents and I was one of them. And that was my coping mechanism. I mean, obviously I had actually wanted to be a pet parent a long time ago, but I could never really afford to do that. Setting up my whole life in Australia, it's like a new thing I have to navigate. And I was like, okay, now I'm ready to have pets actually, because, that's also actually like the pandemic started when my career started. And then I could actually, live on my own, think about having pets. And that was my kind of like coping strategy in a way. And even though it helped, and I thought of my well-being, and I'm like, oh, like my level of well-being is like obviously enhanced. But one of the interesting things that I noticed was actually, I became really attached to them. I didn't leave them. Obviously it was lockdown and you couldn't really go out for that long in the day. But that coupled with the fact that I was a new pet parent in the pandemic and being locked inside, I was so attached to them, and then I had to actually rethink that, because in a way, when I became really attached to them, I was kind of like, am I looking at other aspects of my well-being? Because being attached to them is a great thing, and I'm really grateful for that. But at the same time, it could be too much, like obsessively. I'm always talking about them. I don't leave them at all. And maybe I was bothering them quite a bit because, I was like, I just want to see you. I want to cuddle with you. And so I think this is going to be a fun way to begin the official section where we talk about the human-animal bond, because this is something that we need to address. A lot of us are really attached to animals. And it could be a good thing. It could be a not so great thing that we need to navigate. So what do you think to be some of the biological and psychological bases behind the human-animal bond?
Well, first of all, I don't think you're crazy or obsessive. I think a lot of people became incredibly attached to their animals during the pandemic. And as you said, just in general, because those bonds are powerful and there's all the science in the world to support it. If you start doing research into the human-animal bond, you will see that especially dogs and I think cats as well. And just so everybody listening knows, I have 2 of each. So, I have 1 cat and 2 dogs. I just lost my cat a few weeks ago as well. So I'm sorry for your loss of your cat, because I know how that feels. And he was the 4th animal that I've lost in my life. So I understand that pain very well. But the science is really compelling when you start figuring out how, like human dog coevolution, for example, they have co-evolved to, well, we're all social beings. So first of all, we have the same sort of structure in our brains to be social beings, but they have figured out a way, and I find this to be absolutely mesmerizing. They have figured out a way to get into the very parts of our brains that are the most paternal, the most maternal. They are basically in the parental parts of our brains where we bond with our infants. They are basically our kids. So when people, and literally that's where they bond. So that's where, like, if you were to do a scan of your brain when you are talking or interacting with your pet, that's the part of your brain that would light up, because that's where they are. They are that deep in our psyches. So I think pet parent is a perfectly apt phrase that I use myself, because they are like our kids. And they're like our kids, not only because they've gotten into those areas of our brains, but, there is, of course, they do need our care and they do rely on us quite a bit. but the relationships are so powerful because they are really good for our well-being in more ways that we can even articulate and are only just beginning to understand. Like we know that they lower blood pressure and they reduce, they help you exercise and enjoy, they connect you to nature. They get you outside. They can help you sleep better. That, there's all of these things about the benefits of having pets. They lower your risk of cardiovascular disease and all of those sorts of, things that you can measure more tangibly. But I think psychologically, the needs that they fill are also really intense. And for a lot of people, the fact that they're living constantly every day with pets and they're part of their everyday routines and they're the beings they rely on and interact with the most means that they're closer to their pets than they are to other people. And it is absolutely true that pet loss can be harder than losing a family member who you maybe only, or a friend you don't see as much. And that has definitely been the case for me, where I've lost best friends who I absolutely loved with my whole heart, but I just didn't interact with them as much as I did with my dog, right? And so they're really a part of our everyday lives, and it's a very intimate relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are some very interesting facts, and like you said, the science really backs it up. And I'm like, wow, that's true. Because I am a pet parent myself, and I was like, yes, I confirm all of that. But when I heard that there's actually the science behind that, it's even more compelling to our audience, at least, and for myself. It makes sense, because I'm like, this is how I feel, but I'm not sure why. Now I know why. Yeah, exactly. And obviously we know that the bond that we have with our animals, whether it be pets or, animals in general, would really help us to enhance our well-being. But what I notice is we have different kinds of pet parents. Some pet parents care a lot, while others don't as much. Because here's the thing. My dad used to own a cat. But I don't know why he owned the cat. Because when I was there, he barely interacted with the cat. All he did was he just fed the cat. That's it. And he didn't know where the cat went during the day. All he knew is the cat would come back for dinner. And to me, that was kind of like an interesting thing to notice in my childhood. And that's why it took me so long to finally get a pet, because, I needed to actually grow as a person to know that owning a pet is not just having the pet right there. And so the kinds of bonds we have with animals will be different too, right? Because you said, obviously the bond we have with animals would enhance our well-being. But what about a really strong bond with animal? Because a lot of other people, as I said, they might not have that strong of a bond. It could just be, I have a cat, or I have a dog. That's it.
So this is an interesting point. As I mentioned when I introduced myself, I'm working on a podcast on pet loss, and I had interviewed some people who their whole professional career has been built around pet loss support groups, which is really interesting. And when we were talking about it, they said there's really three tiers in society. There's like the people who don't like animals, and then that's like the first group, and then there's the people who like them okay and they have them and they're fine. And then there's like the obsessive pet parents like we are. Who like our whole lives revolve around our pets in some form or fashion. I do think that there are definitely different degrees of bonding with pets. It does make me wonder, and only you would know the answer to this, or maybe only your dad would know the answer to this, but do you think your dad and his cat had a kind of quiet understanding between them? Or do you think your dad was kind of more apathetic about it? I'm just curious.
I think it's the former.
Like they may have just gotten each other and kind of given each other some space or something like that. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah. Because to be honest, I've never seen him pet the cat.
Okay, now so that to me would suggest that they're not that bonded. Okay. So maybe it is more of an apathy. I was just curious because I think that there are so many different kinds of ways of having relationships. But I do think some people are innately or culturally or individually, depending on, their backgrounds or just who they are as a person, are inclined to bond more with animals than others. There are definitely people who don't understand it. And some of that can be because they've had a really bad experience with a pet. Maybe they have gotten, they've been bitten as a child by a dog or scratched by a cat or something that they've perceived as traumatic or something that was absolutely traumatic, I should say.
Yeah.
And they're just a little hesitant and afraid. What I'm always surprised by, though, is when people don't think they're going to bond with an animal and then they end up doing it. And, you can ask a lot of your friends about this, or I think we all have people in our lives who are like maybe a couple, for instance, where one person in the couple wants a pet and the other one, I don't really want a dog. I don't really want a cat. I don't really want that responsibility. And who falls madly in love? The person who didn't want the pet in the first place, right?
Yeah.
I think animals can often surprise us.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, I do think somebody has to be in a right state of mind. And maybe that's a kind of openness and a kind of empathy to be able to put themselves in an animal's position and really be curious about them. Like, who is this being and how are they trying to talk to me? And what are they saying? And what are their love languages and what makes them tick? Because all of our pets are all very different, right? You said you have 3 cats.
Yeah.
And they're all I'm assuming none of them are the same, right? Like they're all.
Oh my gosh, they're so different. It's hilarious. Right. Yeah.
So I think, there are people who really understand that animals are individuals with completely different personalities. And there are other people who just see them as categories. Like that is a cat.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm like, well, what kind of a cat? Kind of what makes this cat tick? Yeah. And that's the kind of person I think who usually bonds more deeply with an animal.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it depends on, I guess, the level of connection, the level of empathy, because we are talking about, owning pets, but a lot of people do not own any pets, and animals still surround us. It could be you walk on the street and there's a dog that's passing by. Or, like you walk around the neighborhood and there's a cat rolling right in front of you. That's happened to me so many times. And whenever that happens, like there's this strong urge to come and pet them and see them and talk to them. But I think for some others, it's just like they try to dodge them as much as possible. So, this is like very different, levels of empathy and connection. So from my perspective, it shows a lot. I mean, I don't know if this is true or backed by science, but personally, I feel like when we have empathy and connection with animals in general, it means that our level of well-being would generally be higher than those that don't have that sense of connection, because you have that, love for animals, and animals are amazing, in their own ways. And it's not just about animal welfare. It's not just about you as a person, but it's also about, the planet, because that interprets to a lot of other, let's just say little things that they would do. If someone loves animals, chances are they're actually very protective of the planet. That's how I see it.
I think there's a huge connection there, because then you obviously understand that the human, like the catastrophic effects of human greed and idiocy and, how we've been treating the planet in general are so bad, not just for us, which should be enough. That should be enough for people to be like, we shouldn't do this. But when you really have an understanding that isn't just a human-centric worldview, when you really understand that we are part of something much bigger, and that our way of perception, our means of perception is only one way of looking at the world, and you really get curious about animal cognition, then absolutely, because you start thinking, like, what are we losing by thinking only in human terms? Yeah. When we only think in human terms, it's catastrophic. It is. It's absolutely a catastrophic worldview to be so species-centric, right? To have this attitude that only human life matters. It's mind-boggling to me, but it's like historically that's been what animal advocates and environmentalists are fighting against, is this notion that only human life matters, that humans are somehow the center of the universe. This is like a Cartesian kind of idea that animals are automatons and they don't really have feelings and they don't really have thoughts. And like, that is absolutely insane to me when you you can watch any animal show or just watch animals in the wild, and you can see how they problem solve and how they have really complex social relationships in their own groups, and how they have names for each other, and they have entire, like, very rich inner lives. They think, they feel, they have all kinds of cognition, right? There's a kinds of sensibility there and a sentience that is remarkable. And I think it's very hard to imagine how long we've lived in a reality where we don't seem to want to recognize that, and what a loss that is to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that hits really hard when you think about the magnitude of what you're doing and what you're even perceiving in the first place, right? Because like you said, we're part of something much bigger, but a lot of the times we just forget about it because of a lot of things in our lives. And I think for me, it's really easy because, well, I have pets. I look at them every day. I adore them, and I think about what I can do for them. But at the same time, when we are talking about the planet, there's actually so much more. So my question to you would be, how can we foster a greater sense of empathy and connection with animals in general? Because we're not just talking about pet parents, but talking about all humans in general, whether they are a pet parent at the moment or they want to become one, or they actually don't like animals at all. As we've established, it's super important to nurture this sense of empathy and connection. So how can we all do that?
I love that question. It makes me think of this really cool, this beautiful film called, I think it's called Superpower Dogs. And it's about, I have to look that up, but I'm pretty sure it's called Superpower or Superpowered Superhero, something like Superpower Dogs. But that was a particular documentary that was showing in the IMAX in the US with, in 3D.
Yeah, Superpower Dogs.
There we go. Okay, perfect. It's such a great film. And it's about the ways that humans and animals, and dogs in this case, of course, work together to do these amazing feats, these Herculean tasks that humans simply are incapable of doing on their own. And I think if we flip things around, and instead of saying, I think there's often a way in which we want to teach animals human language, right? Like when we work with dolphins, and we work with, and for the record, we should not keep dolphins in captivity, right? But when we work with dolphins, or when we work with dogs, or when we work with, wild animal populations, I think there's so much effort to teach animals how to talk in human language. Why don't we start learning how we need to learn their languages? Because that is where all of their ancient, incredible knowledge lives, right? Yeah. We always want to just make them learn sign language or make them do things to mimic humans. And I do see a value in that, of course. We've learned a lot about animals that way. But why don't we do enough to figure out, I want to know what the heck my dogs are saying when they howl at me. I have huskies, right? And they have a lot of opinions, and they have very different high pitches they use at different times. And I feel like I know a lot of what they're saying, but those are just my dogs, right? But when we're doing studies in nature, I think it's more intriguing, and there are definitely innovative scientists and researchers out there that are doing this. How did they talk? I know there's a study about prairie dog language that's been really impressive, and they've realized how much prairie dogs actually say to each other and how complex their social interactions are. But I think they know a lot, and they know a lot about the world that we don't know, because we have our 5 human senses. And that's limited, right? And animals know and understand and perceive things that we can't even barely get our heads around. And I think it would be fun to flip it around and say, actually, we want to come into your world for a minute, instead of making them always come into ours, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a conscious choice that we can all make. And whether, as I said before, whether you're a pet parent or not, whether you love animals a lot or not so much, it's always important to keep that in mind, because we're surrounded by animals, and we now know, we've established that the bond we have with them, whether we are a pet parent or not, could actually enhance our well-being and the sake of the planet. So why don't we just consciously choose to look at it from that perspective, like consciously choose to step into their world and learn a bit more about them. I think even curiosity, just a spark of curiosity could really help. It doesn't have to be like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna learn everything about, let's just say, dogs today. You don't really have to do that. I think it's really fun to also go to the zoo sometimes. Like I went to the zoo not long ago, and it was just such a fun experience. They didn't have cats there, but they had this like a cat maze sort of thing, where it's hilarious. It's in rural Victoria, in Melbourne. It's like kind of interesting because they draw these different paths, and there are questions. Would you like a treat, or would you like to climb the cat tree? And then you go and then you explore a bit more. And I'm like, even though no cats are here, I feel like I'm surrounded by them. And, I feel like I'm in their head and I know what they're thinking. And I'm looking at it from their perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like, how can we put ourselves in their world for a minute?
Yeah.
Because there are things to be learned there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's why zoos are so great. I love them so much.
Yeah, it's always really fun to think about what, if we knew more about what they were thinking, all the amazing things we would understand.
Yeah, totally. Oh, I love that. And to close out this topic, we've talked a lot about, nurturing this sense of empathy and connection that we can have with animals in general. So I think a big question would be human personalities, because as I said, this is about us trying to, get into the world of animal, whether like regardless of the level of bond and connection we have with them. But I would say personalities matter. So, how do human personalities affect animals? It's not just the other way around, not just like getting to know them, but also how can we affect animals around them, their well-being and our relationship with them? Because this is about animal welfare. I think it's super important to recognize that whatever we think is right might not be the right thing to do sometimes.
Ooh, I love that question. It reminds me of a book that I'm also in the middle of. I'm in the middle of so many books right now, but it's called Your Dog is Your Mirror. And it is, again, it's an interesting kind of a case where things get kind of flipped around. And the argument of that book so far anyway is how animals often mirror our inner worlds a lot. So like they're picking up so much on how we're feeling that they start acting differently based on what we're going through because they're so perceptive. So the book opens with this example of this woman who she has a dog who's like very friendly but kind of neurotic around children. And she can't figure out why, and she tries to socialize her and all of these things. And the author figures out that it's because she has her own guilt around children because she was an alcoholic when she raised her kids. And I guess when she sees children, it just kind of makes her feel all of those feelings rush back, like I could have been a better mother and everything. Well, her dog is picking up on that.
Wow.
On her feelings about children and then acting out on them.
Yeah.
So I think it's one compelling example of how animals are so in tune with us that they are reflecting us in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And we're reflecting them, right? So I think just thinking about as animals as a mirror of any sort, whether they're wild or domestic, and of course those relationships are different, but they do really sort of help you see. And every one of us with our own different personalities and our own different life experiences are going to bring something else to the table. So I think that, it's interesting to watch animals interact with different people of the same animal. And they interact with all of us differently, right? My pets have different relationships with our kids and with my husband than they do with me. And they're all loving. They're just different.
Yeah.
So I do think that they think of us the same way we think of them. Like that human has a different personality than that human.
Yeah.
Like they know.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah. Wow, that is so interesting. Yeah, I actually agree with that because I've talked to my friends a lot about this, and we just, and even the host of the other shows on at LMSL, because we all of us are pet owners and pet parents, and we were kind of discussing like the personalities of our pets. We some of us have cats, some of us have dogs, and some of us even had chickens. So we were kind of like discussing the different personalities of them, and we're kind of like, which part of you do they reflect? And then I thought about my cats, and I'm like, oh, actually, that's true. My cats reflect different personalities of like a different size of me. I have a crazy cat who's like running around all the time and loves everyone. I have another cat that runs away from everyone and just loves to eat and sleep. And I have another cat that's just kind of like she wants attention, but she'll approach you and then she'll run away because she wants you to chase her. So then I'm like, what does that say about me? I need to interpret this now, but it makes sense, It's like, it's such a fun thing.
Yeah, it is fun. And of course, not that they don't have their own personalities. Of course they do. But I do think they reflect us a lot more than we realize because they're so in tune with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing I've noticed as well is when you work on yourself to become a better person, you attract animals. Animals feel at ease around you. And even your pets, their behavior can change too. Because I say this because I realized when I was like at a certain period, I was like really low. And then I felt that my cats seemed to be a bit stressed out, or they didn't seem to be like that active. They didn't seem to approach me as much. And then later on, when I worked on myself and I felt much better, internally, I felt like the relationship that I had with my cats changed as well because they were, happier, more active. They were approaching me more, and they just came to me naturally. And I was like, this makes sense. Such a great pointer.
That's beautiful, right? Because they are deeply empathetic. They're deeply empathetic. And they're going to feel and reflect a lot of what you're feeling because they're that, they're so cool like that. They really are. They're really in tune. Yeah. And I think that's why our bond with them is so powerful. And the thing is, it happens in a space outside of human language. I mean, yes, we talk to our animals and they understand a lot of it, but that understanding is so deep. And it comes from a place that is really fascinating and really like, they just know. They know how you're feeling all the time. It's amazing. So not only do they promote your well-being, because, well, at least for those of us who love animals, like I cannot imagine my life without my pets. I can't. And I would be an absolute lunatic without them. I think I would lose my mind. But they are a good measure for your well-being too, because if if you're happy, they're pretty much going to be happy.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. I love that. And now let's talk about something more practical because we know how important the bond with animals is to all of us. So what is a practice that you do personally, Courtney, to improve and strengthen the bond between yourself and animals? And this is for the benefit of both our mental health and animal welfare, not just about us.
Yeah. So I think the more time we can spend with our pets, the better. I don't think it makes you a totally crazy person. Like you were worried about. Interacting with them, playing with them, walking with them, socializing with them, basically just spending time with them, figuring out what makes them happy, I think makes us happy, right? And indoor cats often don't get enough stimulation. They don't often, people think, oh, cats, they just take care of themselves. And that's absolutely not true because we have to mimic species specific behaviors that they would get being outside, like chasing and running and pouncing on prey and those things. And, just getting down on the floor with them, cuddling with them. Again, going for a hike with them, taking them for a walk. And that can include cats because there is a really cool resource called Space Cat Academy where you can take classes for like $30 American that like how to harness train your cat for adventures and things like that. But anyway, I think that just being curious about them, as we've said before, and figuring out what makes them tick, investing time in them is really rewarding. And even if it's 15 or 20 minutes a day, it's enough to make a big difference in both of your lives. Yeah,
absolutely. I think when it comes to spending more time with our pets, it's actually not that hard, but life happens sometimes. And this has happened to me where I had days where I'm just like, exhausted from everything else and I forget to interact with them. And that's one of the challenges that I face personally. But I wonder if you've noticed, because you work with a lot of animals and people that interact with animals, what could be some of the potential challenges when we try to engage with our pets more? We want to spend more time with them, but we just fail to.
I think that's a good question. I mean, first of all, don't beat yourself up if a day or two goes by. They're going to be okay. But, I think you could do all kinds of things, like just set a timer or just put it into a habit that you already do. So like, every morning when I brush my teeth, I'm going to also pull out this string and play with my cat. Or, I'm going to watch TV anyway. I'm going to get down on the floor with my dog and do some basic tricks. I think the more you think of training as work, the harder it is. But instead of thinking of, like, if you have a dog with a behavioral issue, for instance, or a cat with a behavioral issue, instead of thinking, I have to work with this, I have to train them, it's really thinking more about how can I bond with them and how can I have fun with them? And then there goes my husky, by the way. There goes.
Hi.
Wait, where is he?
There we go. We just talked about this. Perfect feature on this episode. There we go. I love that so much.
I think he knows we're talking about him, but
yeah.
I think just habit. I think it's called habit stacking, where you already are doing a habit. So just add some time in with your pets during that, whatever it is that doesn't make you stressed out, because it should be fun.
Yeah.
For both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. What about those that don't have pets but would like to improve this bond with animals? What should they do?
I think you could go borrow someone's pets for a few days.
Maybe pet sit?
Pet sit. Yeah, I do pet sitting and it's really fun. You can get yourself around animals. You could volunteer at an animal shelter. You can, of course, we're talking about companion animals because those, usually it's kind of hard to bond with a wild animal. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, you can, a lot of people want pets but can't have them because of housing restrictions, or they're just, they don't have the money, or they don't have, there's some obstacle. But I'll tell you, animal shelters are full of animals who need interaction. So you can go walk animals, you can go cuddle them. Sometimes even shelters will have they just need cat cuddlers, people who can go, help the cats who aren't socialized. There are animals all over the place who are in need of human interaction. And you can pretty easily, at least in the United States, it's really easy to become a volunteer at an animal shelter or rescue. You can foster them if you can't keep them long term. You can volunteer to transport them across the country if they need transport. There's really kinds of all sorts of ways that you can interact with pets.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for those recommendations. I love that we are giving recommendations to audience with and without pets, right, to improve the bond with animals. There's so many ways to do this, and I really love that. I can talk about pets all day, but in the spirit of this conversation, I would also love to give you some time to talk about the topic that you're super passionate about, which is the dark side of the U.S. shelter system. And I know it's probably not going to be fair to just cover the topic in a few minutes, but this is our open mic. Go for as long as you would like. And let's talk about it. Let's hear what it's about, and let's see what we can do about it if we can participate in some ways.
I really appreciate this because talking about pets is so much fun, and the human-animal bond is so powerful and can really revolutionize the way that we feel and think about the world. The sad, tragic part that I watch every day is I am watching thousands of companion animals being killed every day across the United States due to overcrowding in shelters. And the statistics are not always, they don't really tell the story, but it's about 1 million animals a year in the US who are being euthanized in animal shelters because there's too many animals and not enough homes. And it is really, it's really, on the one hand, it's a complicated problem. And there's a lot of sources of, there are a lot of reasons why this problem exists. everything from, we breed too many animals. There are puppy mills. There are too many breeders. That doesn't mean all breeders are irresponsible, but the bottom line is there are too many animals being born and not enough homes for them. And there's a lot of blame to go around. Communities blame the shelters themselves. The shelters blame the communities, saying you're dumping the animals here. All of these things are true. I'm stumbling because it's so hard to even kind of explain in a very short amount of time. But the long and the short of it is that there are very few people working to fix the problem, and it's actually a pretty easy problem to fix. There are too many people who buy their pets from breeders and don't realize that a perfectly wonderful companion animal is literally just waiting for them at their local shelter. There are myths that these dogs and cats are somehow broken, that they're going to be vicious, or they're unsocialized, or all of these things that are just absolutely not true. The animals who are being euthanized for space across the country are healthy, adoptable. Now, they may be injured. They may need medical care. They may have heartworm or some other totally treatable ailment of some sort. But they are perfect animals. They're absolutely loving, wonderful companions, and they are not even being given a chance. And they're relinquished by people for all kinds of reasons. And so I really hope that we can come together as a society and figure out not only how to keep pets out of shelters, but how to keep them in their loving homes, right? So we want to keep them out of shelters in the first place, and we want to keep them in their loving homes. And some of the ways that we need to do that are by changing some systemic issues. Like, for instance, in the United States, there's not enough affordable housing for pets, and people do often have to choose between finding a place to live and their beloved family member, which is really horrible and unfair. And insurance companies don't help because most of them restrict certain breeds like pit bulls, huskies, German shepherds. If you have those, you're not even allowed to live in a certain apartment complex. Or there's arbitrary weight restrictions, like your dog has to be under 50 pounds, as if a dog at 51 pounds becomes destructive or something, which isn't the case. So we need to make veterinary care more affordable. It's really hard because veterinarians are struggling, and they're not making money. And not only that, they're committing suicide, and they're leaving the profession at alarming rates because they're not being supported, and people can't afford their vet care. So there's those sorts of systemic things we need to fix. Social issues, pet families in crisis, if they're experiencing homelessness or some kind of financial hardship, they need resources. Those resources need to include pets, because pets are not, trivial, frivolous material possessions. They're members of the family. So it's really important that we think about them that way. So we need to keep pets out of shelters in the first place. And we also need to get people adopting. And I think for that, there really needs to be a cultural revolution, in a sense that, we need to get rid of these myths that the only way you get a good dog or a good cat is by going to a breeder. Now, most people don't get their cats from breeders, but a large percentage of people get dogs from breeders. And there's just this notion that that those dogs are somehow better, and it's not true, because what makes a good dog is your time with them and your willingness to work with them and train them. And that's whether you buy them or not. A dog is a dog, right? And it has canine psychology that you work with, period. So I just really want to encourage people to understand that, there's a real joy in going to a local shelter and knowing that you are saving a life, and that pet in turn is going to turn around and save you. I promise. They do more for us than we do for them. And so I guess I would just implore people to really kind of think about those options, because it is a very, very hard road for those of us who are in the profession trying to fix an enormous, again, social, systemic problem, and there are very few of us who are actually trying and doing the work, and we're exhausted. Shelter workers, rescue workers, veterinarians, everyone in the profession is suffering from some kind of compassion fatigue. And it's just going to take a little bit of a shift in our perceptions. I promise you, shelter animals aren't broken. I've had 6 of them in my life. No, in my whole life, like dozens of them from the time I was a kid, right? And they're all wonderful. So just please think about adopting your next baby instead of buying one from a breeder.
Oh, that's a beautiful message to close with. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. I think for us in Australia, actually, now that I think about it, it's quite similar. I don't know much if there's a natural crisis, but I know that there are very similar problems. And in other countries, I don't know, there could be other kinds of problems as well. I think it's what you just talked about is specific to the US at the moment, and it's quite alarming. And it's good that we acknowledge the problems, but it's also good to look around you in your local area, in your own country and your own region, what other problems there might be, so we can support anyone involved in helping animals, because they're so important to us. And having this bond with them, like we said earlier, could enhance our well-being and help the planet as well, right? So it's not something that we can just say, yeah, it doesn't really concern me because I don't have a pet. It's actually so much more than that. Even if you don't have a pet, it's actually something you can do. And I think it's super important. So thank you for being here, for sharing that message. It's such a lovely conversation that we've had. And honestly, we could go on all day talking about pets. But yeah, I think let's let you go because I know it's late. We'll definitely love to have you back sometime. I love your Brene Brown energy.
Oh, thank you.
Love your kindness throughout this whole process, because it was a little bit chaotic this morning, setting everything up. But yeah, it's been a really great topic. And, I'm going to have to think about it a bit more and do some research about what's actually going on in Australia. It's actually quite intriguing now that you've mentioned it.
Well, reach out and let me know. And thank you for this work you're doing. I love it that you are helping people and animals live their best lives. And I really admire what you're doing. And I look forward to listening to your other episodes.
Right back at you. Well. We admire what you're doing. And we're so glad that you came on our show. All the best with your next podcast. And I'll definitely put that on my listening list and figure out what you're working on. Thanks for being here, Courtney.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
You've been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast, produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.